Hi everyone. The FIDE World Rapid Championship started today. It's a 13-round Swiss tournament in Warsaw, Poland. Magnus Carlsen is trying to retain his crown. He's current Rapid World Champion. The top players in this open event are Carlsen, Nakamura, Duda, Nepomniachtchi, MVL, Caruana, Giri, Grischuk, Karyakin, and Svidler. So we're going to follow Carlsen's games. Today they played the first 5 rounds. The time control for the event is 15 minutes plus a 10-second increment per move. So in round 1, Carlsen has white. His opponent is Merab Gagunashvili. He's a Georgian grandmaster, 36 years old. He had a peak classical FIDE rating of 26-25. So Carlsen opens with e4, and they go into a Ruy Lopez. Pretty standard stuff. And right here, Carlsen plays his trademark move, d3. So Carlsen has been known throughout his career to play this early d3 in the Ruy Lopez. It cuts out a lot of sharp theory and possible variations, and Carlsen just wants to play positional chess with an original middle game. b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, a4 threatens to win a pawn because the pawn on a6 can't recapture without losing the rook. So the rook slides over to b8, pawns get exchanged, both players castle, both players push their h-pawns, knight c3, d6, bishop d2, rook e8. Carlsen gets the knight to the center of the board, and black decides to retain his dark squared bishop. Okay, this is quite a long game and very equal, a lot of maneuvering, pretty symmetric pawn structure here. So we're going to skip ahead. Let's see what's going on at move 29. So here we have bishop e3, bishop g5, and now we get the first imbalance in the game. Carlsen takes the bishop with his knight. Okay, so now we have a bishop versus knight situation. Carlsen tries to get the king up a little bit here. Pawn to g6 stops that idea. h4, pawns get exchanged. Rook c7, and so forth. Let's skip way ahead to move 45. Oops, move 45 right here. So here we have rook a7 check. Okay, still equal material. This pawn is under threat. These pawns are weak. Okay, the white king is very well placed in the center of the board. Okay, the black king retreats, so it's now cut off by the rook. Okay, Carlsen gets his king further up. Maybe he might even make some mating threats. He gives up his c-pawn. The engine doesn't mind. It's still in equal position. Rook c7 attacking the c6 pawn. Okay, check. King moves up further. Okay, the black rook attacks the f4 pawn. Carlsen takes on g6. Okay, his opponent takes on f4. King g5 attacks the rook. Rook slides back, keeps an eye on the knight. Okay, rook takes c6. And king to d7. So we have still equal material in this position. This pawn probably will fall soon. White's pawn is more secure by the bishop there, but even if white wins this pawn, it won't be enough to win the game. For example, if white picks up the b5 pawn, if black had to, he could even give up the knight for white's remaining pawn, because a bishop and rook versus a rook is a well-known drawn endgame. So let's skip ahead a bit. Let's look at move 70. So in this position, Carlsen plays bishop e1, knight c4, bishop f2, lining the bishop up with the black king. So white's threatening rook to d5 check, picking up the rook on d3. So black needs to do something about that, like move his king. And he correctly moves it back to b7, giving up his b pawn. Look at what would happen if he had made the mistake of moving it to a6, trying to retain his pawn. Do you see White's strong reply in this position? Carlsen would have played rook to c7, threatening a mate on a7 in conjunction with the bishop. There's nothing much black can do. For example, if black tries knight to b6 to cut off the effect of the bishop, then there is rook to c6, pinning and winning the knight. Okay, so in this position, king b7 was correct, giving up the pawn. Okay, but black is still perfectly fine. It's all zeros. So let's skip ahead a little further. Let's see what's going on at move 82. So in this position, Carlsen plays rook c3, king b8, bishop b6 attacks the knight. Now you can see the knight is attacked twice, defended only once, so maybe black needs to move it to b7. It seems to be his only square. These squares are guarded by the king, this square is guarded by the rook and the pawn. So it looks like he has to move it to b7. Well, surprisingly, black just gives up the knight and takes the last white pawn. Any reasons? Well, as I said earlier, this is a drawn endgame. But when I looked a little closer, I realized black really has no choice but to give up the knight. For example, if he did move it to b7, then white could play bishop to c7 check, and maybe king a7, rook a3 check, and now there's no move other than knight a5, giving up the knight. Okay, that was a possible way to play actually, and again the engine says that's also a draw. But going back to the game, Carlsen does take the knight, and they play this position out for quite a while. Let's jump ahead to move 102. So here Carlsen is in check. He blocks the check with the bishop. Okay, black moves his king to a4. So even though the king is trapped on the a file, black is in no danger here. This is a theoretical draw. It's a table-based draw. Carlsen plays rook b4 check. Now black has two legal moves. Which one would you play? Well, hopefully you said king a5. Looks pretty suicidal to move it to a3, right? Well, that's what black did. He moved his king to a3. Now, I don't know if it's because he was in time trouble or he's just fatigued on move 103 of a round one game, intimidated by the world champion. But it's a pretty strange move to put your king right in line with the bishop, giving white a discovered check. In fact, Carlsen responded with rook b1 check, and black resigned. Okay, and that was actually black's only mistake in the game. So he held a drawn position against the world champion for 102 moves before he cracked with this inexplicable blunder. So black's going to lose the rook and the game. Now, I don't know if he was thinking that this would have been the discovered check. Maybe that was black's thought, and he figured I'll just defend the rook. But even that would have lost to the nice move bishop to a3 check, skewering the rook. And if the king takes the bishop, then the rook falls. So it's kind of funny to see that blunder by a grandmaster, but anything can happen in a rapid game under extreme pressure. So after round one, Carlsen has 1 point. Let's take a look at his round two game. So in this game, Carlsen is black, and his opponent is Samvel Ter Sahakyan. He's an Armenian grandmaster. He's 28 years old. His current classical FIDE rating is 2637. He won the 2011 Under-18 World Championship. So his opponent is a strong grandmaster. Okay, so Carlsen opens with e4, and again they play a Ruy Lopez. Okay, but this time Carlsen has the black side of a Ruy Lopez. And they're following the main line, and here Carlsen castles. So he's threatening to play the Marshall attack with the move d5. And this is part of his World Championship preparation. He played this position a few times against Nepomniachtchi. And just like Nepomniachtchi, Carlsen's opponent here decides not to test Carlsen's Marshall and plays the anti-martial move a4. Okay, so now there's a threat to win a pawn on b5 because the a-pawn cannot recapture without losing the rook. So Carlsen defends the rook with bishop b7, then d3, d6, knight bd2, and now Carlsen decides to gain a little space on the queen side. He plays knight a5, attacking the Spanish bishop, which retreats, and then he plays c5. Okay, knight f1, pretty standard Ruy Lopez maneuver with that knight. It can go to g3 or e3. Queen c7, connecting the rooks. Bishop d2, and Carlsen grabs even more space with b4. Knight g3, bishop c8, so that bishop wasn't doing much on that diagonal, so it's going to reroute itself to this diagonal. Knight h4, both knights are pointed at the nice f5 square. Bishop e6, so Carlsen has rerouted that bishop to challenge the strong Spanish bishop, which can influence the f7 square. Knight h, f5, bishop d8, Carlsen retains his dark squared bishop. Okay, this is also a long and fairly equal game, so we're going to skip ahead and see what's going on at move 34. So in this position, let's take a quick look. Material is equal, but what I notice is Black's pawns on a5 and e5 are both pretty weak and subject to attack. Okay, White decides to play queen d5, attacking them both and offering a queen exchange. Carlsen does exchange queens, and now the rook is attacking both pawns. Okay, even though both pawns are attacked, I don't think White has a winning advantage in the position. The engine calls this plus 0.5. Carlsen decides to defend his a-pawn. He doesn't want to give White a passed a-pawn. And now, this is a little inexplicable to me. I don't know why White is not taking the e5 pawn, but he doesn't. He plays knight f5. The engine says that's just as good as taking the pawn. Both are giving White just a slight edge. Okay, knight f4, attacking the rook, and again, White refuses the pawn and retreats the rook. If he does take the pawn, I suppose Black's rooks can get active in a hurry. That pawn might be weak, and Black should have enough compensation with his counterplay. So rook f d8, White doubles rooks, and a pair of rooks gets exchanged. All right, so let's jump ahead to move 48 in the game. So in this position, we still see equal material. White plays rook c4, knight b2 attacking the rook, rook c3, rook d7. Still not much going on. Let's skip ahead to move 59. Okay, so we see that the players have eventually traded rooks and we have a knight and pawn endgame. Black managed to get a pawn all the way to the 7th rank. Carlsen is protecting it with his knight. He has just attacked the white knight, but Black's pawns here are weak and White can take one of them, but it looks pretty drawish. Let's see what happens. White does take on h5, king g6 attacks the knight, White protects, and now Carlsen realizes he can't make any progress. He's down a pawn. He's just going to bail out with a draw. So he removes his knight from protecting his 7th rank pawn in order to attack the g4 pawn. White takes the 7th ranked pawn. Knight takes g4, attacking the white knight. And White sees no hope for pressing for an advantage either, so he bails out with a draw. He plays f4 and says, go ahead and take my knight, because when you do, I'm going to take your last pawn. And so now Black cannot win. All right, so the game quickly ends. Carlsen attacks the d pawn, takes it, gives up his knight, and then takes White's remaining pawn. So after 2 rounds, Carlsen has 1.5 points out of 2. So let's move ahead to round 3. So round 3, Carlsen has white, and his opponent is Alexei Shirov. He's a Russian grandmaster. He's 52 years old. He's been around for a while. I do remember following his career over the past couple of decades. He's quite a strong player. His peak FIDE rating was 2711, and he qualified for the candidates tournament in 1990 for the World Championship cycle. So he's quite an accomplished grandmaster. So Carlsen opens with d4 this time, and he plays this move g3 here, getting this so-called Pseudo-Catalan opening. The Catalan opening occurs after white has played this Queen's Gambit setup and then pushes his pawn to g3, but Carlsen pushes his pawn before or without pushing the c-pawn at all. And he actually played this same setup in his World Championship just a couple weeks ago against Nepo and was quite successful with it. So he's really using his World Championship preparation in this tournament. All right, let's keep going. c6 was played, kind of blocking that long light squared diagonal. c4, d takes c4. So white is often content giving up his c-pawn in the Catalan. He just simply plays bishop g2. Black does protect that pawn and tries to hang on to it. Castles, bishop b7. Knight e5, a thematic move in the Catalan, opening up this bishop, putting pressure on c6. This makes it hard for black to develop his queenside. For example, if black wants to develop that knight, he's going to have to give up the c6 pawn to do it. Okay, e6, b3, trying to break down that pawn structure. The pawns get exchanged. Knight b d7, so black does give up the c6 pawn and white takes it. Queen b6, attacking the knight. Carlsen defends it with d5. And now this is a pretty complicated position, a little difficult for me to understand, but black makes a weak move here according to the engine. He plays knight takes d5, taking this pawn, removing a defender of the knight, blocking the bishop. And this is an inaccuracy because of Carlsen's next move. The only move that retains a strong advantage, the engine calls this plus 1.4, is the move Carlsen played, knight to a5. Okay, so this hits the bishop on b7. It also pins the knight on d5, because if the knight moves, the bishop will fall. So let's see what black does about this. Okay, he plays rook d8, and Carlsen decides to get rid of the light squared bishop. So now the knight here is pinned by that bishop, and this strong Catalan bishop has no counterpart. The a-pawn is also weak. The rook has the half-open file. So even though black is still up a pawn, the engine seriously prefers white. Okay, now we have a bit of a tactical skirmish here. Knight to c3, attacking that pinned knight. Black decides to go ahead and take it, opening up the diagonal because he's counterattacking the white queen. So we see some exchanges here. The queens get exchanged, white gets his piece back, and then black plays bishop to c5. So he's getting ready to castle. He developed his last minor piece, and he's defending the a7 pawn. Okay, bishop b2 was an inaccuracy according to the Lichess engine. Looks like a very natural move, developing your bishop, pointing it at the g7 pawn, gaining a tempo, connecting your rooks. But perhaps Carlsen overlooked this opportunity, bishop c6. This was suggested by the engine. It looks strong to me. It pins the knight, and that keeps black from castling because then the knight would fall. The engine suggests if Carlsen had played that move, black could try king e7, getting the knight out of the pin, then bishop b2, attacking the g-pawn, f6 defending, and then white can pick up the b5 pawn. And white's pieces are more active. He has the bishop pair in an open position. His rooks are currently better, and so the engine says white still has a strong edge. Okay, but Carlsen played this bishop b2 move, and that gave the opportunity for black to castle. Rook a c1, bishop b4, rook d4 hitting the bishop. Knight c5 was a mistake according to the engine. Okay, that attacks white's bishop on b7. The engine suggests that black should have simply retreated and consolidated, protecting the rook, unpinning the knight. The knight can move if white decides to double up rooks and attack it. The rook would be defended sufficiently. So black is just consolidating his position, makes it tough for white to do anything. Okay, but instead, black counterattacks the light squared bishop, and the bishops do get exchanged, but then white takes on b5. Okay, attacks the knight, black defends it, bishop a3 hitting the other rook. Okay, the rooks double up, rook to c6, h6 getting luft, rook a6 hitting the pawn, knight moves so the rook defends laterally. Okay, but Carlsen takes the knight with his bishop, giving it up in order to take the a-pawn. So now Carlsen has this pawn lead on the queen side. Let's see if he can achieve a victory from that pawn. Okay, black pushes g5, rook b7, rook f8. So a little bit of maneuvering here. One pair of rooks gets exchanged. Rook c8, g4, rook c3, b4, king g7, king g2. Rook gets behind the passed pawn. The pawn starts to push. f5, I think this is an inaccuracy, and I think I understand why. I think probably white has a winning position right here. A grandmaster probably would know the answer to that. But with this pawn being pushed, the black king has less shelter from checks by the white rook, and we'll see more about that in just a moment. So he's pushing this f-pawn forward, and now the king is a little bit bare. Okay, h3, h5, pawns get exchanged, rook b8, king g6, b7. So the white pawn has gotten all the way to the 7th rank, and there is a threat. The threat is rook comes over here with a check, followed by queening the pawn. So black has to do something about that, and he does. He plays king g7. Now, if you ignore the rest of the pawns over here, we have a very familiar endgame situation. In this type of situation, white needs to be able to remove his rook with check or with some kind of threat in order to promote his pawn. In order to avoid that, the black king needs to stay on one of these two squares. If he tries moving forward, for example, that's going to give white the room to check. Also, if he even moves over here on the f7 square, staying on the 7th rank, then white has this surprising move rook to h8, threatening to queen the pawn, and if black takes it, then there's rook to h7 check, skewering the rook and winning the game. So that's why the king must stay on one of these two squares. Now, of course, black knows that, and he does stay on those squares, but the problem is white's king is going to start to march over to the king side. And in fact, right here, black either resigned or ran out of time, so white won this position. Now here's a sample of what could have occurred. Black can maybe do nothing but move his king back and forth or keep his rook on this file, keeping his eye on the passed pawn. Meanwhile, the white king will march over, attack the rook, and start to move up the board to protect the passed pawn and release this rook and then promote. There's really nothing black could do. Okay, so Carlsen wins this one, and after 3 rounds, Carlsen has 2.5 out of 3. So let's see what happened in round 4. So in round 4, Carlsen, for the second time in a row, has the white pieces. His opponent is an Indian grandmaster named Harsha. He's 21 years old. And we'll look at the whole game here. Carlsen opens with e4, and we get a Sicilian defense. Okay, in this position, Carlsen goes for bishop b5 check, just avoiding most of the sharp Sicilian theory like the Najdorf or the dragon or any other type of Sicilian. This is known as the Moscow variation. And White's idea is simple. He just wants to get castled, wants to build up a pawn center, maybe play it sort of like a Ruy Lopez. So just a quieter game, more positional. Knight d7, a4, interesting move. I think the idea of that is if black kicks the bishop back, he won't be able to expand further with b5 because the pawn is waiting for that. Okay, knight f6. Carlsen defends it with his knight. Okay, a6, bishop drops back. b6, d4, opening up the center. Queen takes back. Queen is safe there. We don't have knight to c6, for example. Bishop b7, castles. e5, hitting the queen but creating this positional weakness, this hole on d5. Queen goes to e3, queen c7, rook d1, putting the rook on the half-open file, bishop e7. So black gets castled. Bishop c4 was an inaccuracy. Engine says knight c4 would have been better. I don't see what's wrong with this move, though. It's a more active diagonal for the bishop. Okay, knight c5, b3, protecting the bishop and maybe getting ready to place this bishop here or here. Okay, rook a d8, bishop to a3. Okay, d5, an inaccuracy. Knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes. So a lot of massive trades on the d5 square, and then knight to c4. So gaining a nice square for the knight. Rook f d8, pair rooks gets exchanged, queen e2, bishop f8, rook e1, f6, h4, getting lift, pushing the h-pawn further, maybe attacking on the king side, rook d4, h5. And now an interesting move, knight takes a4. Little tactical idea here. If white takes the knight, then this knight is hanging. So maybe black has just won a pawn, but the engine doesn't think so. It calls that an inaccuracy. Engine says better would have been b5. Here's the engine line, exchanging pawns, and then playing knight to e3. Okay, but let's take a look at what happened in the game after knight takes a4. So Carlsen takes off that bishop, and maybe that's the reason this wasn't such a good idea, because white just removed maybe a key defender of the black king. The black king may be a little vulnerable now. Queen f3, pointing down this diagonal, maybe thinking of a check on a8. King g8, and indeed, queen to a8 check comes, and then white picks up the pawn on a6. Okay, knight c3, knight takes b6, white gets another pawn, and now white is up a pawn in the position. Rook d2 is a mistake. Apparently best was queen c6, pinning the knight. And then something like queen a5, queen c7, pinning it again. Queen b4, rook b8. Queen c4 check, trading the queens. This might have been a better way for black to have some drawing chances, but white is still pressing for the win in that position. So back to the game, rook d2. So this is quite complicated, difficult for me to understand why that's a bad move, but let's see what happens. Knight c4 attacks it, just gives up the c2 pawn, and apparently taking it is a big blunder, and that's what black did. I guess black's king is just too vulnerable. Black just gave up the d file. Maybe the rook can get into the action here. Maybe this pawn can push and cause some weaknesses over here on the king side. Let's see what happens. Rook a1. Okay, so getting to the a file. Rook c1 check. That's a tactical blow that goes wrong. Okay, so it looks weird. You're playing rook to c1 check, and now white takes the rook. Do you see the point? Yeah, the point is black wanted to trade some pieces here since white was attacking, and he gives up this rook in order to get this fork. But then after black takes it, here's the problem. Carlsen plays queen a3, attacking the knight, and black resigned. The knight is actually trapped. It has only one square to go to, and if it had gone to that square, d3, then Carlsen has queen a8 check, king f7, queen to d5 check, forking the king and the knight. So the knight is just lost after that tactical rook trade. So black blunders in the end, but white was pressing anyway. All right, so after 4 rounds, Carlsen has 3.5 out of 4 points. Let's look at the 5th and final round of the day. So round 5, we have a very exciting matchup here. The white player is Alexei Shirov, who's a well-known super grandmaster, born in Latvia, 49 years old. He had a peak classical rating of 2755. He was once ranked 2nd player in the world. In fact, he won a match against Kravnik in 1998 to earn the right to play Kasparov for the World Championship. Unfortunately, that match never took place because of a lack of sponsorship. And Shirov has been playing really well lately, even at the age of 49. He's recently rejoined the 2700 club, and he's in great form. Let's see how he does against Carlsen. Okay, so Shirov opens with e4, and we get another Ruy Lopez. Okay, we'll play through the whole game here. So we get some standard theory. And again, we get this castling move intending to play the Marshall attack with d5. And just like Carlsen's earlier round, Shirov decides to go for the anti-Marshall move a4. Rook b8, getting the rook off the a file. The pawns get exchanged. Knight c3, d6, knight d5, knights get exchanged. And now Carlsen makes a move that the engine calls a blunder, goes from 0.0 to plus 1.8. Carlsen plays knight to b4. And I don't know why that's such a terrible move. The engine says you should have moved it to d4, and then this position could have occurred. And I think this position is probably just very drawish. And that just is so ugly. I hate that pawn structure like that. So maybe Carlsen is playing a little risky. He probably knew this move, knight b4, wasn't optimal. But he wants to avoid exchanging pieces and getting a drawn position. He needs to win as many games as possible. I think there's at least one player that has scored 4 out of 4. So if he wants to retain his title, he has to mix things up, play risky chess sometimes, and that's what he does with knight b4. I think the problem is after c3, the knight gets stuck on the edge of the board for a while, and black is in danger of never getting that piece back in the game. Okay, d4 takes control of that c5 square, so the knight can't move. Okay, bishop f6, pawns get exchanged. Bishop e3, again controlling c5. Queen d6, okay, so that supports the knight getting back into the game. Knight d2 was an inaccuracy according to the engine. The engine suggests bishop c2 is a better move. I don't really see why. But anyway, knight d2 was played. Bishop e7 was a mistake. Apparently it's better just to get that knight into the game right now. I don't know what's wrong with bishop e7, although I don't see the point of the move either, other than maybe releasing the f-pawn. I don't know. But anyway, f4 is played. Pawns get exchanged. Queen moves to b6 with check. King h1. Finally, the knight gets off the edge of the board. Okay, and when he does it, it's claimed to be an inaccuracy. Okay, bishop now moves to c2. I guess the pawn was blocking it. stronger diagonal. Maybe the queen can get in here, attack h7, bishop b7. Queen e1 was a blunder. Apparently queen f3 was best. Okay, and I don't want to get into all the details. It's a little complicated for me. But queen e1, rook b e8, lining up with the queen, so the queen gets over to g3. Okay, bishop takes that pawn on d5. Bishop takes the pawn on c7. Okay, queen c6. So material is equal. I do like white a little bit, I guess. He has this nice pawn majority, possibility of getting a passed pawn over here. His pieces seem a little more active. That rook is kind of trapped and passive, and white's rooks are well placed. Okay, bishop e5, threatening a mate here. So f6 defends that. Bishop f4, knight e6. Queen h3 is an inaccuracy. Again, I don't see why threatening a possible mate here is such a bad idea. g6 defends that. Bishop h6. Knight g5 attacks the queen rather than moving the rook. And white decides to exchange the minor pieces and plays bishop b3. I think black is happy to exchange pieces in this position. White did have some pressure, so more exchanges make the position safer for black. Okay, g4, knight d4 attacks the queen, in fact, forks the queen and the pawn. But then queen c4 addresses that issue, and the queens get traded. So now we have one pawn holding back two pawns. So I think the position is pretty drawish at this point. Knight b5, rook e2, getting the rook to the 7th, attacking the b pawn. g3, bishop e7. Yeah, I should point out that, yeah, this bishop here is hanging for quite a while. That queen was defending the bishop, but after it moves, that bishop now has no defense. White can't take it now, of course, because his queen is hanging. So after the queens get exchanged, the bishop is still hanging, but it's not, because the back rank is weak. If white had taken it, there would have been a mate. So that's why that bishop is sitting there for so long until white finally pushes the g-pawn, getting loofed. Now there's no back rank issue. So black needs to move the bishop. He moves it to e7. Okay, so another possibility, maybe this was drawish, was to take this pawn and threaten the knight, and then if the pieces get exchanged, black does have an extra pawn, but I'm sure this is a drawn position. So Carlsen decides to keep the minor pieces on the board. Knight a3, rook takes b2, knight takes c4. Rook e2, defending the bishop. I was wondering about attacking this pawn here, which cannot be defended. Apparently that's drawish after the move knight to e3, attacking the rook. In fact, that's a defense of the pawn. Black cannot take it. If he does, he loses material to this fork. Notice the rook cannot move and defend the bishop at the same time. Okay, so Carlsen probably saw all that and played his rook to the e-file, defending his bishop. Knight b6, king comes up, knight d5. Carlsen retains the bishop, knight f4. Okay, a little bit of maneuvering here. Not too much going on. It's kind of weird, this pawn is just sitting here for a while. Neither player seems to care about it. Maybe both players realized it was doomed anyway. So still not much going on in the position. 3-on-2 pawns over here don't really mean much with this particular pawn structure. Okay, white attacks the bishop, it falls back, attacks it again, pushes it around a bit. Carlsen pushes his pawn. Okay, now there is two pieces. There are two pieces attacking that bishop at the moment. So Carlsen moves it to d4. And now knight e7, bishop c5 attacking the knight, and rook e5 attacking the bishop, rook d2 check. And then king f1. Okay, it's important not to move the king to the corner because you'll get mated with this sequence. Okay, that's a checkmate. So Shirov correctly puts the king on f1. Then rook c2 protects the bishop. And now here comes a blunder. I think Shirov was in a lot of time trouble. Carlsen had a couple extra minutes on the clock. Knight f5 check. It's a very subtle blunder. I think the point is this pawn is hanging, and if black can take it, he might win this game. In fact, black is threatening to exchange the minor pieces and then take on h2. Knight f5 makes all of this possible. I think the defense here, according to the engine, is rook e6 check, king h7, rook c6, pinning the bishop to the rook and keeping the rook defending the bishop. Okay, but going back to the game, the problem with knight f5 check here is black can attack that knight. And where can that knight go? Well, it can go to a couple safe places here or here defended by the rook, but it doesn't matter because black is threatening to exchange his bishop for the knight and then take the h2 pawn. So no matter where white places the knight, black's going to have a winning advantage. Anyway, the last move recorded was knight e3 because then Shirov had his flag fall at this point in the game. So Carlsen wins on time, but he does have a winning position. The continuation would have been exchanging here and then taking this pawn on h2. Okay, so that was the 5th round. Carlsen managed to get 4.5 out of 5 in his first 5 rounds of the tournament. Also at 4.5 out of 5 are Duda and Jobava. Out of 5 points, players with 4 out of 5 are Nepomniachtchi, Abdustorev, Grishchuk, Gureyev, Anton Gujaro, Neiman, Gelfand, Korobov, Giri, Firouzja, Fedoseev, Chaparinov, and Petrosian, all with 4 out of 5. Okay, so I look forward to seeing more of the games tomorrow. Thanks for watching.